Good morning, good afternoon, dear folks. Welcome to the VUU on this Thursday, September 24th, 2020. I'm Michael Tino, member of the Church of the Larger Fellowship's lead ministry team and one of your co-hosts today. As we begin today, I want to note that it has been a rough 24 hours for many people within Unitarian Universalism and outside of Unitarian Universalism. And some of those of us for whom it has been rough are your co-hosts and your guest. And we're in a fairly fragile place today. And so we ask that you bear with us, and we will have the conversation that we need to have and learn wonderful things about making justice in Arizona. But I did want to name that Alandria Williams, former co-moderator of our association and one of my dearest friends, is with the ancestors now. And if Alandria taught anything in her years of leadership and mentorship and teaching, it is that we need to center care for one another at all times in our faith movement. And so we're going to care for one another. And if our show is not an hour, we will trust that you understand why. Sunday's Church of the Larger Fellowship worship service at 8 will be co-led by Aisha Hauser and Antonia Bell Delgado, and they will be honoring the ministry and the contributions of Alandria Williams to our faith and to our world. And we hope that you'll join us on Sunday for that. And I'll probably just sit here and cry for a little while. So that's where I am here in Peekskill, New York, where the weather is cloudy and my child is in school with other people. And so I'm afraid for our world, and I'm afraid for everything. And I wish I had nice things to say that would make us smile and laugh. And right now I don't. So welcome. Thank you for being with us. Let's have our co-hosts introduce themselves. Quiana Perkins, how are you this morning?
Fractured, but I'm here. My name's Quiana Perkins. My pronouns are she and her. I will change those in a second. I am in grief to me is like a big ball. And right now, the ball of grief is so big, it's taking up the room I'm sitting in. And I know that one day it'll be so small I can put it in my pocket, but that's not today. And I just am holding my own grief and the grief of the people who I love, and the people who loved Alandria. And I wanted to say that Blue, Black Lives Unitarian Universalist, is doing something today. I've chosen to not be on social media, so I don't know what that event is, but please seek out the pastoral care that Blue offers. And please look for the event that's happening later today if that is something that you need to help your spirit. I'm going to pass it to my friend Don.
Hey folks, I'm Don Fortune. I am here in South Jersey with my current caregiver, my cat, who is Octavius Brooks Frothingham, because we all need sort of a furry transcendentalist in this sort of day. Yeah, we're all hurting. And one of the things that comes to mind in this time is, and I talked about this with my people this week, is the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John, who I don't usually quote because I think John was a little, I think John maybe drank. But he talked this is in the story about Jesus raising Lazarus, and I our Christian friends talk about the raising of Lazarus, but I always stop before then in the part where Jesus arrives and learns that his friend has died, and the mourners who are there see Jesus begin to weep, and they say, "See him weeping, how he must have loved him." And this sort of grief is the price we pay for loving someone. It's what it takes to open up to people and to let them into our hearts. And it's awful and it hurts. But look at us mourn how we loved her. How we loved her. Yeah, here in South Jersey, it's a quiet day. It's overcast. It's just sort of that kind of day where you're never sure if it's morning or afternoon. The light is just sort of gray all the time. And oh, there are claws. There you go. We are hurting, and we are in a hurting world, and that is real. And I would just like to send a word out to my minister friends who all are in this place where we're all hurting and we're all trying to be ministers too. So let us remember to be gentle with one another. Yes, and he will be dearly, dearly missed. I'm going to hand it back to Michael because I don't quite know what to say at this point.
I'm not sure there is anything we can say. Quiana named that ball of grief is filling the whole room, and if we think that we can pop it right now, this will be a train wreck of a show, and it will also hurt all four of us. And Tanner Linden is our communications coordinator, and behind the chalice, Tanner, do you want to say hi to folks? Or yep, here's Tanner.
Hi folks, I'm Tanner.
Tanner is monitoring your comments on YouTube, and so Ndidi and Darby, thank you for being with us. Tanner is feeding us your comments. Those of you who are watching us live, it's good that we know we have a community. Our super fans are here, Quiana. And speaking of super fans, speaking of VUU super fans, we are actually really happy to have Janine Gelsinger with us today. Janine is the executive director of UUJAZ Arizona, and Janine serves on the Joint Ethics Steering Panel with our lead ministry team member, Christina Rivera. Janine hails from Phoenix, Arizona, is the single parent of two kiddos, Vivienne and Ramona. Is it Vivienne? Or
I mean, sure, either way.
And Ramona. And Janine is going to tell us some really exciting things that are happening in Arizona. So before we went on the air, Janine, you were telling us a little bit about congregations in Arizona coming together to discuss the Commission on Institutional Changes report. Why don't we start there? Tell us how that went and how UUJAZ Arizona came to sponsor that or pull it together.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me. It's good to be together today. Last night I was thinking like, oh gosh, how are we going to do the VUU tomorrow? But it's good to be with community and grieve together. I'm not great in isolation, so I really appreciate us being all together today. And I think talking about some of the work that we're doing, especially the work towards fulfilling the recommendations from the Commission on Institutional Change, it feels like work that honors the kind of Unitarian Universalism that Alandria called us to, right? The kind of Unitarian Universalism that Alandria knew we could be. And so continuing this work is the way that I'm going to try to continue to honor E and all the lessons there. So when the Commission on Institutional Change finished their report and published Widening the Circle of Concern, that book, we set up as UUJAZ, as the State Action Network, a discussion group. It was a 6-week session, although in retrospect, I wish I would have scheduled it for 10. We did 2 chapters each time, and we certainly could have spent an entire 90 minutes on each one. And it was really amazing. We asked for leaders in congregations to participate. And so we got board presidents and ministers, faith development leaders. We had membership team folks, all sorts of congregational leaders. And we discussed for 6 weeks, you know, what are you reading? And then how do you apply it to your own congregation? And we specifically focused on the recommendations and then thought of ways we could apply them, or for some congregations, they already had ways they were applying that, and so they shared it with others. But to be together as a state, I think, was really powerful, because sometimes for UUs, it's hard for us to, you know, we read the recommendation and we say, yes, that sounds good. Other people should definitely do that. And so sometimes we have a hard time looking in the mirror and seeing like, oh, we need to do that. And so I think one of the things that was really beautiful about having lots of different congregations together is that sometimes you wouldn't recognize something was happening in your own congregation until you heard someone else tell a story about an example that happened in theirs. And then you would say, oh no, we do that too. And so there were some really beautiful moments where people could kind of share those reflections and then realize that that was something that they were experiencing in their congregation, especially as, you know, the way that their committees were set up, the way that their boards were run, the way that they were welcoming people, what some of their policies were. And so it was a really good experience. I was seeing a lot of growth, and that felt really good. And then the group at the end decided that they wanted to keep meeting. So they're going to meet every other month for the next year to talk about their work, to keep each other accountable, that we're not just discussing it and then putting it on a shelf. And then some of the groups already, so at a few of the congregations, the board decided that they would spend a certain amount of time during each board meeting this entire year discussing what they were reading. They're all reading the report together and then taking time to discuss it at each board meeting and how it applies to their work. So there's some takeaways from there that seem important.
Quiana, if you're talking, you're muted.
That is just so logical. I don't know how that works. That I would be not heard. So I love the idea of innovative ministry. What was the prep that it took to get those people in the room and make that 6-week commitment? Because it seems like there would be the process to get that going. Like folks have to seem to be like in a willing space to step into that. What work happened to get folks there? I think we always get excited, like we'll just get everybody in a room and not realizing there's like 27 things before everybody gets in that room and the dream thing happens. So if you could talk to maybe a little bit about your process.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the immediate work to get there was, you know, send advertisements to their congregational newsletters, ask for leaders to participate. You know, our communications team made a cute little Canva ad, put it on social media, all those things. But honestly, what it really took in the end is exactly what you thought it took. And I reached out individually to leaders and invited them. it's always about, I always say, like, I have one skill and it's relationships, and anything I ever do is really just about that. So it really took reaching out to individual leaders and saying, like, hey, I know that you've been discussing this specific thing in your congregation. We've had conversations about this. I really would love to have those conversations together with these other leaders. I think you have a lot to bring to this. I think it will help you with a certain issue you're working on. And so really knowing the leaders and congregations and what they're struggling with or what they're wanting to improve, or and then just making a personal invitation is really what got a lot of people into the room.
Nice. And then are you providing any structure now that they're going to continue to meet? Are they self-governing, for lack of a better word, or will you have to engage in the project continually to maintain it?
I'm still going to be there. I'll still, you know, I set up all the Zoom schedules, and I'll still facilitate a little bit. It was interesting over the 6 weeks, you know, I took on a facilitator role, but it changed each week. And so the very first week, I spent a lot of time talking about covenant, because if we're going to do this work, we're going to make a covenant together, and we're going to talk about centering marginalized voices and all the work that we need to do in this group to make this a space to have this discussion. And, you know, that also comes from the commission report. I mean, the first chapter was about being grounded in our theology and who we are as UUs. And so we spent a lot of time in the first group talking about how we're going to be together. And I got some pushback from participants. They were like, you talked too much about covenant. And I was like, oh, thanks for the feedback. We're going to continue to talk about covenant.
Can we come back to that really fast? Because I think it is super important. Somebody asked us to name the book, and I'm going to let Michael do that, but I want to come back to covenant with you in relationship. Let's talk about that a little bit, if you don't mind. Michael?
So the book, the work that Janine is referencing is Widening the Circle of Concern. It is the report issued in June by the UUA Commission on Institutional Change. I'm fairly sure every congregation got a printed copy that I know, and you can order additional printed copies from the UUA bookstore, but I'm fairly sure it's actually still on the UUA website, free, if you just want to read it there. For some of us, accessibility wise, it's easier to have a book, and for some of us, accessibility wise, it's easier to have a computer screen. So read it however you can do it, but read it.
Nice.
And back to covenant.
Well, and I'm going to take it even I guess it's a blended question, which is, can you talk, I think we use the word covenant a lot in UU spaces, and it's a good word, but I don't think we always talk about what a covenant is. We don't break that down. And I think I'd love to hear you talk, Janine, a little bit about where covenant and relationship kind of become one, right? And why having a covenant when you're having a small, intimate group like that, why it matters. Do you feel like you could speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're referencing, but tell me if I'm not getting it right, Quiana, about where you were coming from, is that sometimes we use covenant to mean like the rules of the group. And that's not what covenant is. Covenant is how we agree to be together in this space, and the way we do justice work is just as important as the work that we're doing. And so when we make a group covenant, it's acknowledging that, you know, whenever you get more than one person in a space, there's going to be disagreement. And especially when you're talking about institutional change, it's not easy for folks. And so when we have a covenant, we're saying we know that there will be conflict. How are we going to work through that conflict when it happens? And how are we agreeing to then come back together? And that a covenant's a living document, and it will be broken. It's not a rules. It's saying, when this goes wrong, how are we going to come back together? Instead of, you know, saying, oh, you broke a rule. Like, covenant shouldn't be used as
a weapon.
As a weapon, yes, as a means to punish folks. Covenant is really about who are we together, and how do we come back together when we've strayed from what we committed to?
Yeah. Yeah. And when I hear it that way, when I hear it in that expansive place, that it's not a set of rules to hold me to a set of behaviors that that maybe I don't agree with. I love when it's an expansive space that says, come here, be who you fully are. And then if something changes in our relationship, in the way that we're moving and flowing together, we have a space to come back to that and become whole again. That reframing for me, and realizing and saying out loud what covenant is, every time somebody uses it, I've been doing it the last few days, it has been just so important to me that we understand the language that we're using, that we don't say we all have a common language and then not break down that common language. The second thing that you spoke to, and I just want to kind of rally cry, is relationship matters. Relationship is everything. I believe in the speed of relationship, and relationships move at the speed of trust. I believe in asking people how they are genuinely. Today I started and asked Don very sincerely, how are you? Not the surface, not the grocery store answer, but the deep, sincere answer. It is where, when even with my therapist, I say to them, how are you? Because if they're not in a good space, we can't be in a good space. They have a covenant. We have a covenant that says I just think it's so important. We're so conditioned, I think, to think things are always going to go well, but they don't always go well. And we have to have a place to come back to when they don't go well. And so I just appreciate hearing that and knowing that covenant is there for us when things don't go well.
I also think for sometimes what covenant was to us in this space is also a way to set the expectation that we're going to move and be together and speak in anti-racist, anti-oppressive ways in this group, because we are doing work of anti-racism and anti-oppression as we move through the commission report. And so doing this work, like I said before, it matters how you do the work, not just that you're doing it. And so in our group, I changed things every time. People don't always love when the agenda shifts every time. And I did that intentionally because, you know what? Embrace discomfort. It's not really about that. And so we thought about how we would speak in the covenant. So some of the points for our covenant in this group were wherever you start from is okay. And because some of us have a lived experience of oppression and have been speaking about this our whole lives, and some people are brand new to this work, everywhere you start from is okay, but speak from your own experience. Don't tell anyone else's stories but your own. Acknowledge your social location when you speak. Center voices from historically marginalized folks. This report is really many voices of folks in Unitarian Universalism, and that needs to be centered over our own feelings about it. Take space and make space was part of our covenant, but discomfort is okay. And every week we would talk about that point in the covenant. Discomfort is a road to growth, that if you can just stay in it, stay in your discomfort, on the other side of that is growth and change. And so, there's rarely a change that happens without some of that discomfort. And so, we made that part of our covenant so that we really agreed that that's what we would be moving through together.
This reminds me of the concept of covenant. Reminds me of the way you're discussing it. Reminds me of when Sean Parker Dennison gave the Berry Street lecture a number of years ago. He talked about failure is not an option; it's a guarantee. And I think sometimes, in my experience, I like to think of myself as already enlightened, already wise. I already know this stuff, and that when we come in, we're going to do this thing, and it's going to be beautiful, and it's going to behave itself, and we're going to march through these steps and achieve a goal at the end. And I had a really valuable experience in one of my first student ministry positions where my supervisor said in our first staff meeting, we're going to disappoint each other, you know, and the covenant is aspirational and flexible, and it allows us room to make mistakes and to grow. And I think one of my biggest challenges is being in the discomfort, and you know, I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan. I like to be right. I like to, you know what I'm talking about. I like to not feel, in my own judgmental words, I like to not feel stupid, right? I love to be, I've always said it's one of my goals to try and always be the least informed person in the room, so that I'm always able to learn. You know, I never want to be the smartest person in the room, because, you know, I've got, I always want to be listening to people who know more and know different things than me. And yet that is uncomfortable when it happens. And so having those conversations, I'm curious how many people all told were in that group. And I'm wondering what you saw, what happened, and how people dealt with it when that feeling of, I have to completely undo everything I thought I knew about a particular thing, how that happened within that group. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, first of all, I love that you said you don't like to feel uncomfortable, because I think you're not alone in Unitarian Universalism. I think that that's very common. And I know it's shocking. And I mean, my response would be like, then you need a more challenging covenant, right? If it's easy to be together, then your covenant isn't challenging you. And to answer your question, how that kind of happened in the group. So I kind of scaffolded the group to be very tightly facilitated in the first few sessions, and then to kind of loosen up. And so, because it takes people a little bit to get used to being in a different space, a space that's a little bit uncomfortable. And so what I mean by tightly facilitated was when folks started to, so for instance, the question would be, here's a recommendation for the Commission on Institutional Change. How do you see this happening in your own congregation? And when people feel uncomfortable, sometimes they avoid the question and answer a different one. And so they would say like, oh, here's a great thing we're doing in our congregation, right? Or like, oh, we have lots of folks of color in our congregation and they're happy, so we must be great, right? They would avoid the question because it was difficult to examine what might not be going well in their congregation. So in the beginning, as the facilitator, I would call folks back into covenant and say, I hear that you did this amazing thing. Wonderful. What do you think you see from this recommendation that you could change? And so just calling people back to what the question was and you pushing a little bit. And then as we went on, they spent more time in breakout groups and they were able to kind of self-facilitate in that way, right? Like these are all leaders. And so they didn't need to be trained in how to facilitate. They needed to get used to the kind of challenging covenant we were calling them to in this space. And so towards the end, we were able to kind of relax a little bit. I spoke a lot less and they spent more time in their breakout groups or their discussion groups. There were 38 people registered, but we usually had around 15 to 25, depending on the week. And so most of the time we put them in breakout groups to have discussions and then came back together and gathered all of the recommendations and ideas they had in a shared document.
I have a more, meta maybe is the right word question. So first of all, I want to say I'm very envious that you get to call your network UUJAZ.
Yeah. Jazz.
Those of us who live in places like New York don't get acronyms like that. But that aside, is this part of UUJAZ's work normally? So it is to say, like, I know lots of state justice networks that focus on either legislative things or partnerships with community organizations, which is all great and good, and I know you do that too. But is this like internal justice work new to you, or is this has this been part of what UUJAZ has been doing for a while?
Yeah, it's definitely new. I've been in this role as executive director for just a year. It was a year in July. And so it's definitely an expansion of our programming. It's also still missional though. If we think about, our mission, we have a 4-part mission. So part of it is nurturing social justice teams and congregations. So how are we going to nurture social justice teams and congregations if we don't talk about the way we're doing the work and how our congregations function? And what is your committee structure like in your congregation? And is it done in an anti-oppressive way? But yeah, it is new. There are state action networks that just focus on legislative advocacy, and we do that as well. But we have lots of programs beyond that. And I like Meadville Lombard's structure. They have kind of a within, among, beyond structure. I don't think that's necessarily unique to them, but that's where I learned it from. And so, within work being the personal work that you do within yourself, and among being work you do in your community, right? So in your congregation to dismantle racism and anti-oppression work. And then beyond being out into the community. But justice work is justice work. And so I think there's a lot we can do in our own congregations. And sometimes you have a tendency to think that our justice work is out there, right? We need to put on our yellow shirts and go out in the streets and show everyone what justice is. And we can't really authentically do that unless we're also doing work within our own communities. In my opinion.
To speak to that, we've been doing a lot of, so my role I work at First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor. And some of the work that we've been doing has been around I'm the coordinator of congregational life. And so I work with a lot of groups to help make sure they're fulfilling their own mission, but also that their mission and their work is aligned with the larger community. And I've really started to add a component of internal and external. So if we're going to do this work externally, what does that work look like internally? So if we're going to have a conversation, let's say about voting, how are we going to make sure the folks in our building are voting? But then if you're going to go out in the community and ask folks to vote, are you working with somebody who's already doing the work, who already does the work really well in a way that you can partner with them? How are you going to be their backup and not center stage? And so really shifting the question from, which brings me to something else Janine said, which is people being like, that doesn't happen here. And then having that moment of oh, that happens here. And so just like with Covenant, I hope everyone's tracking all of this, just like with Covenant, where it's about what do we do when this relationship needs to be repaired, building in that beginning and the planning to say, how are we going to do this work outside and inside, and making that a part of the process and not assuming the work doesn't need to be done inside as well. And sometimes saying until this work is done inside, we can't go outside, and having that distinction that I just saw Don make a face yeah, it's really healthy if we go out and we're a part of community dialogues about racism, but are we having that same dialogue on Tuesday night at 7:00 on Zoom in our building, in our brick and mortar? So I find, this call to Covenant to talk about when things fracture. I find this call to do internal and external work just so apropos. And I think this season, weather-wise, political season, a season of uprising, a season of pandemic. There is no better time to make sure your relationships are tight, to make your spirit is tight, and to make sure you know who your people are. Don keeps saying, my people, I checked in with my people. And you know what's funny? I don't know who Don's talking about, but you know what I do know? They know who they're talking about. They know who they mean in their heart. And so I just really call on folks to like think about impact, internal, external, and also just to know who your people are, know who you're calling together, know who you're rallying, know the work they have to do, and be ready if you're going to call a community together to do the work that needs to get done. So I'm starting to preach. I apologize. I'm going to bring it all in. But at the end of the day, we are community, we are people, and we are relationships. And if you don't have those in your brick and mortar, if you don't have those on your online community, baby, get those. You need them. You need them. You need them. You need them.
You know, I love bringing it back to relationships, obviously, because that's who we are and what we're about. But in thinking about Michael's question, is this new? The other thing I want to lift up is that the reason we started doing this is because this was what people were asking for, right? So everyone shifted under COVID and everything was different. And for a bit, it was all our congregations could handle to figure out how to put their services online and pastoral care. And, you know, it makes sense. That was their priority. That's what they did first. And then as we started looking at like, what else can we hold? You know, Arizona only has 13 congregations and some of them are really tiny. And so some of our congregations still don't even have Zoom services. Like they're, you know, they don't have a ton of resources to figure out some of this stuff. And so asking our leaders, you know, what can we do to support you? Everyone just needs to do what they can. So even though sometimes, you know, commission discussion groups maybe weren't something that UUJAZ would hold, this is a piece we can hold now because I don't have a congregation to run, right? I don't have to do any pastoral care. I'm just doing justice work in UUJAZ, and that's what my team is focused on. And so there were lots of pieces that we picked up that sometimes would happen in congregations, but what's the point of a state network if we're not serving the needs of our congregations?
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I didn't mean to imply that there was something wrong with I think it's absolutely fantastic. And it makes so much sense that like we have to like have our stuff in order if we're actually going to be real partners to people in the community, right? If we're actually if we're going to do the partnership in an any sort of accountable way, like we have to have our stuff together. I want to lift up Shige Sakurai, writes in the chat, it seems that covenant check-ins that aren't about someone broke the covenant could help. Like just to say every now and then, hey, how are we doing, instead of waiting for a complaint. And I want to lift up their comment partially because one of the things that I found useful is to build in how did we do with respect to our covenant into process observation. So lots of people do process observation and, you know, there are forms for it, like how did we do? But one of the questions in that should be, how did we do with respect to our covenant? And we can lift up, oh, we did a good job today being, you know, uncomfortable and sitting in discomfort. Like there were a couple moments where people were profoundly out of their comfort zone and sat with that together. So like 2 thumbs up, and that gives that chance for a positive reinforcement of the covenant as well.
Yeah, or even pointing out times where people are doing really well at exemplifying part of the covenant. Like, say you have someone say, well, I mean, I just feel like, and then they catch themselves and say, you know, I feel like I don't see this in my congregation, but I'm reading this report, and so I know it must be true. And so centering that experience of marginalized folks was part of our covenant. And so you can say then, hey, like, great job, Debbie. I noticed that you really are centering voices of marginalized folks in your response. And I appreciate that you're working so hard to commit to our covenant. I mean, you can give, you know, it's like parenting, right? You can like, you know, punish people for not following the rules, or you can also say like, hey, I just caught you doing something good. Good job.
I really appreciate that. And I also want to call out Michael's call in, call up, call excitedness about Michael saying, build it in. About once every month with my therapist, I actually say, hey, is there anything that we need to talk about? Even in supervision, I make sure I always ask, like, is there any concerns you need to bring to my attention, so that I'm not always dumping on folks and I'm making sure that I pick up my weight in the conversation. I also do it with intimate partners and friends. Are we in a good place? So making it not just something you do when you're in your faith home, but something you do in your life. Building in opportunities to hear feedback is just so critical. If no one can ever tell you you're not being your best self, that's not good. And if they can't tell you you're not being your best self because you've put up so many gates and defenses around hearing not comfy feedback, that's some work that you have to do. I don't always like hearing what other people say on the other end of my, like, hey, how are we doing? Like, it's not always, doesn't feel great to ask, but I only ask questions when I'm ready for the answer. And I'm always ready to hear that I can be a better partner. I can be a better parent. I could be a better co-parent. I could be a better friend. I could be a better faith, spiritual support for somebody. So because I come from that place, that's the place I'm coming from. I want to get better and be better with us. It doesn't seem like a criticism of my entire person, right? It becomes a point of learning for both of us. So I just say, if you can do it at church, you should be able to do it at home. And if you do it at home, you should be able to do it at church. And asking if things are okay should be something you can do in both places. Can y'all believe it's 12:49? I'm like, wait a minute. We didn't think we could do 15 minutes. I'm just blown away by us.
We knew Janine had exciting and fabulous things to talk about, though. So we're glad that you're here. AJ Van Tyne writes, our congregation has a practice of right relationship checkouts at the end of every committee meeting. Sometimes it's brief and we probably could go deeper, but it's a good established culture. Yeah, how did we do with relationships? It's a really good question to be asking one another.
I've known friends who, in their intimate relationships, in their romantic relationships, who have a scheduled quarterly special dinner. Like, let's just do a check-in. Like, are we happy where we are? Are we, it's sort of a time to dig deep and look at, the state of the union, as it were, and are we happy with this? Are we not happy? What could be better? And I have another friend who this is an amazing thing that they said was, whenever they get into a relationship, one of the conversations they have is, how is this going to end? Because it will.
Talk about that. Yes, preach.
Because it will. Either we will break up or one of us will die. But this relationship, as we understand it right now, will end. And how do we want to conduct ourselves along the path so that it is not jarring or violent, or so that it ends in a way that is as healthy as can be? How it's like we're getting together and I've done that before, and it's not always worked the way I wanted it to, because life and I'm imperfect and all that other stuff, but it's a wonderful conversation to have. Along with that, we're going to disappoint each other. Like, let's be real about that at the beginning, and not paint this impossible picture that we're always going to agree on everything, and the steak is never going to be overdone. Let's understand that we are imperfect and human and all of that.
My new favorite word is lumpy. We're lumpy humans, and we get lumpy.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, we are lumpy humans, and I said to Michael before you all came on, it's like these human suits leak and they're itchy sometimes, and like it's okay, and to like honor that, and to like not pretend like we don't want to cry, to not pretend we don't want to be sad. Like I get to be the full range of human, and that means I'm gonna maybe not like you after 2 years. That's why I have a co-parent and not a baby daddy and not an ex-husband. We found the relationship that matched where we could keep each other the most happy. Do we love each other all the time? No. But do we have a Venn diagram that overlaps 90% of the time? Yes. And we find consensus in what we do. We find balance in what we do. And we respect each other in the places where we know we overlap. And there's just so much grace in that. And just finding the spaces where we work instead of trying to wedge things in places they don't work. And not knowing when to say, this is over. This is time. And yeah, I'm going to leave it right there.
I love that we have connected right relationship straight through from like our state legislators to our personal relationships. I love that we've like connected all of that because it's so true. That relationship is everything. That you started there, Janine.
It is absolutely everything.
And it's about being right sized and being relationship requires us to be willing to hear that we're wrong. And we have to be vulnerable. I mean, that's part of what being in a relationship is that it requires a level of vulnerability. It requires a level of trust that I'm going to entrust this other person or institution or whatever with some of how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Dawn, when you said begin a relationship with discussing how it will end, I've heard that once before. And I heard it from a 16-year-old in an OWL class that I was teaching at a UU congregation. What? Yep.
Wow.
I know, I was like mind blown. And he was like, yeah, whenever I'm dating a new boyfriend, I always say like, how's this gonna end? Because I don't want anything messy all over Instagram about, and they talk about and it's a covenanting, right? Like, how are we going to end this? And I want to stay friends when this is over, because we're 16, and so how's it going to end? And I was like, man, the youth, and so to bring it back to Elandria, this is part of what we do as UUs, is we learn lessons from our youth and young adult leaders and folks that have been introducing covenants into their relationships when they were 16 are the future leaders of our denomination and leaders now.
Right. Yeah. I 16. Oh my God. I can't even. I'm 55 and I have days where I'm not that astute. Dear God.
Same.
So it's 12:56, and maybe Michael, were you about to bring us back around?
I was gonna bring us to a close, but you say what you need to, Quiana.
No, we were on the same bus. So seek out the folks, find your people today. Find the people who love you in ways that you can't even understand. Find the food today that makes your heart happy. Find the drink, if it's water with some lemon. Stay hydrated, because tears make you dry up on out. Do what you need to do to find peace in your heart. If you are reeling from Ruth's death, like me and Ruth are besties. If you are reeling from Brianna's death, if you are reeling from the impact of COVID, if you are reeling from the impact of state-sanctioned violence and the death of Black people all across this country, if you are just seeking healing and an open heart, find people who love you. Pick up a phone, send an email, go sit on your stairs and meet your neighbors. Who knows, maybe that's the joy you need to experience. But you are worthy of goodness, you are worthy of relationship, and you are worthy of people wrapping around you in the times when you can't wrap your arms around yourself. And today might be one of those days for you. So I know CFL is doing something on Sunday night. I know that Blue is doing something today. Keep your eyes out. I wouldn't be surprised if UUAA was doing something, but find your people, wrap yourself in love, and be love.
Yeah, in Alandria's last public Facebook post, their dispatch from the bed, from E's hospital bed, E talked about the importance of caring for ourselves and caring for our communities. So find your people, get cared for, and care for each other. And that is the best way we can honor our friend and our mentor. Next week, we're talking about public health, science, and congregational life. We have on my friend, Dr. Ross McKinney, who is an infectious disease expert and medical doctor, and Reverend Manish Mishra Marzetti from Ann Arbor, talking about congregational leadership. And we're going to talk about, I get to trot out my PhD. Those of you who know me, like, if you don't know me, I've got a doctorate in cell biology. I studied lung immunology professionally before I went into the ministry. So I get to trot this stuff out, how we actually make sense of the science that we're learning of COVID and make decisions for what we do as congregations that actually take that into account. That's what we're talking about next week, should the world not end before then. And I love you all. Be well. Be safe.
Oh, you too. Janine, thank you again.
Thank you, Janine. Go
Thank you.
kiss your babies for me. I think they're so fun and funny.